Joining in, we'd love to know. I don't think we need to record. We haven't started yet. Great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Shekufe Zanji. I'm the Global Technical Lead with the Early Childhood Development Action Network. And just a warm welcome to everyone to the first of the Masterclass series. And we hope you are going to be with us for the whole time here. So as we've shared in the chat, share with us your name, where you're joining in from, your organization. Why are you here today? What do you hope to learn? And be sure to select everyone when you're doing that. So just really quickly, this is the first Masterclass of the Masterclass series. Hope you've signed up for many of them. The curators of the series has been Nork, along with us at ECDAN. And it's part of the broader systems thinking initiative that we co-host with Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So today's session will be around theme 1, where you'll be getting the big picture overview of systems and complexity informed evaluation. So the Systems Thinking for Early Childhood Initiative, it's a partnership between ECDAN and Harvard, when we are supported by Porticus. We have 4 pillars of work: systems research, systems investing, systems measurement, systems design and implementation. And today, this Masterclass series is part of the systems measurement pillar. Just a reminder, this is the first time where we are having the opportunity to have certification. So you can qualify for a certificate of participation if A, you register for the sessions you're interested in attending. That's really important. B, you complete readings ahead of time so that you're well prepared for the sessions. C, you participate in at least 50% or 7 out of the 14 sessions. You don't have to participate live, but you can watch the recordings, although that needs to be done before May 17th. And you complete a short survey after every session. So that's what qualifies you for the certificate. And then you'll have a digital certificate that you can share on LinkedIn and anywhere else you would like. After each of the Masterclass sessions, because we get this question all the time, yes, all the recordings will be made available. Yes, all the readings are available. If you've registered and you're here, there'll be an automated email with all the session resources and recordings available. And it will also be on the main Masterclass website under each session. Every day we'll be updating it with the YouTube links to the videos, etc. And also the post-session survey will be available. We also have the community platform, which is the ECD Connect, where you are welcome to continue the conversation after the session. And if you have questions, we'll have the speakers, the Masterclass teachers also pop in a few times during the week to answer any questions you may have that may have been unresolved. All right, the basic format for each of the sessions will be the following. We'll have welcome and introductions as we're having now. We'll have the main Masterclass session. Then we'll have the dialogue with the early childhood expert, where they'll share their reflections with the systems expert. We'll have participant Q&A and then the closing and next steps. This is just a rough outline. Each session may be slightly different. Finally, some housekeeping. If you have questions for the speakers, there's the Q&A chat there. You can put your Q&A button. You can click on it, put in your question. You can also review other questions. You can vote for them if you really like the question that's already there, so that it moves up. And you can see sometimes the questions will be answered in text, so you can look at the answered version to see what has been answered. And finally, make sure you select everyone when you're selecting your chat so that everyone can see your chat. All right. Finally, we're so grateful to UNICEF ICARO for supporting with the Spanish translation. If you do require interpretation, you need to click on interpretation and select Spanish, and you will have a Spanish translator, Mitzi, who is with us the whole time. Thank you, Mitzi. All right. All right. Oh, sorry, guys. So It's my pleasure today. I'll be introducing the speakers. Today we have, our session is called Transformational Systems Change and the Role of Evaluation. And I will now stop sharing so that I can introduce you. You can actually see who the speakers are. So I'm going to introduce you, just one quick second. All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce the systems experts who will be running the Masterclass series today. Michael Patton, he's a seasoned independent evaluator with more than 50 years of experience. His work is focused intensely on transformational evaluation, transforming evaluation to evaluate transformation. He's the author of 8 major books on evaluation, including utilization-focused evaluation, creative evaluation, practical evaluation, and developmental evaluation. And he will be accompanied by Charmaine Campbell Patton, who is a second-generation evaluator and 12th-generation European settler based in Minnesota, USA. Her professional experience spans 15 years of program design, implementation, and evaluation work across a range of fields, including youth engagement, education, criminal, and juvenile justice, and philanthropy. She specializes in qualitative research methods and utilization-focused developmental evaluation, and she's also the co-founder of the Blue Marble Evaluation Network. And of course, our early childhood expert, who probably needs no introduction to everyone on the call, but it's Dr. Hiro Yoshikawa. He's a community and development psychologist, conducts work on child and youth development in partnership with non-governmental organizations and ministries in Latin America, South Asia, and Middle East, as well as the United States. His work studies the effects of public policies and programs related to immigration, early childhood youth development, poverty reduction, and children's development. He's the co-director of Global Ties for Children's Center at New York University, as well as a professor of applied psychology at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael and Charmaine. I just want to tell everyone, this is an entirely new field for all of us. So, let's sit with the complexity, let's sit with the challenge, and let's just be curious and dive into this learning adventure together. So over to you, Michael and Charmaine.
You're going to open?
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. We're very happy to be with you. And we're going to start off with some broad framing for you, and then we'll try to make as many applications to early childhood development as we can, and have a conversation at the end about that more specifically. So, we are coming to you from Minnesota, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the indigenous Dakota and Ojibwe people, which is on land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851, also the birthplace of the American Indian movement. We want to frame our work in that context, as well as, recognition of the broader context in which we're all coming from. So it's really great to hear from so many of you where you're joining from, and we'll try to draw connections from around the world as much as we can today. So I'll hand it over to Michael to kick us off with transformation.
Welcome, everyone. Delighted to work with you today. Appreciate your taking the time to think about these issues with us. The land acknowledgement that Charmaine just did is an example of bringing into our work a sensitivity to the cultural and political systems that we're all a part of, and making those explicit. And a part of what has emerged over these last 50 years is moving beyond just doing projects to actually transforming systems. And that's what we're going to introduce to you in a whirlwind tour of some of this thinking, and invite you to engage around how this applies to your own work. So there is, out of this context, a lot of research and practice of people who've been looking at how transformations occur. A book that I was involved in doing with 2 Canadian colleagues called Getting to Maybe How the World Has Changed looked at social movements aimed at changing the world, major movements that are aimed at not just carrying out traditional projects, that have clear and specific goals and objectives, but indeed changing systems. And the blue marble evaluation is about how we are all part of the earth together, and looking at how our systems are interconnected globally. So it moves from local to global to connecting the local and global is one of the themes of looking at global system change. Tanya Steele, the World Wildlife Federation, in their report said, "We are the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet and the last generation that can do anything about it. The stakes are high, and that involves systems thinking and systems change to bring about those changes." This era is now being called the Anthropocene, which means that we as human beings are having more impact on the earth and its environment than the natural processes of the earth. And part of what this means is that we're connecting not only our social and human systems, but our environmental and ecological systems are connected because we are in a climate emergency. And the call is for all hands on deck, for all of us to be involved. There are good things happening in the world, people dealing with alternative energy and coming together around issues of equity and system thinking, but there continue to be over-reliance on fossil fuels. The numbers about the dire nature of climate change are increasing. And so part of what we do with evaluation is try to sort out the balance between the good things and the bad things, and to help improve and intensify the good things that are happening and help people mitigate and adapt to the bad things that are happening and to understand those things in systems terms. Tim Hartford, in his book on the data detective, said, "All we need now is a way to focus attention on a problem, climate change, that is too slow to be called a crisis and too dangerous to be called anything else." And we invite you to think about how whatever your work is, at whatever level, and you're engaged in early childhood work and other kinds of work, to connect it to these larger issues. That's part of thinking globally about systems change. So what we mean by that is to understand that with the climate emergency, with the pandemic, with increasing world hunger, with increasing violence in the world and conflict, nuclear threats, misinformation and disinformation, global inequities, that the interaction among these different challenges has come to be called the polycrisis. That is, overlapping crises that affect each other. And bringing a systems perspective into that work at whatever level you are is to see the interconnections between these things. All of us affected by the pandemic, all of us affected by climate change at whatever level you're operating. And as a part of that, yesterday was an Earth Day declaration where we launched, as a part of a global effort, an initiative to engage in looking at these things in that way. And I'm putting in the chat a link to a declaration that deals with these issues as they came up in how we, as a evaluation community, can deal with the various ways in which social and economic, let's see if I could get to everyone here.
Michael, go ahead. I've copied it and put it in the chat.
Thank you. Excellent. Appreciate it. So this is an opportunity for you to look at a declaration on how our work is related to social, economic, and ecological systems, and to sign a declaration making you a part of the global community that's dealing with those issues. And we invite you to do that. So what we're dealing with is the dominance of what's called a linear project mentality. Logic models really serve well to clarify what a project is, what are the resources going into it, what activities occur, what outputs, outcomes, and impacts are resulting. But that treats projects in an isolated, closed system manner. And what we're talking about is applying systems thinking that look at what else is going on in people's lives and programs, what other ways are they connected beyond what's going on in a program or project. Projects tend to treat the participants as only engaged with that project. But in fact, everybody's lives are connected with family, with culture, with political and economic systems, and that affects children and youth as well. So to see through a complexity lens is to see the ways in which these things occur, not only in our planning. Projects are very top-down, planned, control model, but complexity acknowledges that other things happen, like the pandemic, like climate change, like political and cultural dynamics, and that to be prepared to deal with what emerges is a part of complexity. So systems transformation involves a profound, significant, and enduring change in the way that members and elements of a system act and interact, the way they operate and relate to one another, resulting in dramatically different processes, outcomes, and impacts within the system and in relationship with other systems. It's about these dynamics that we're going to be talking. And when you look at historical examples, given the climate change, given the polycrisis we talked about, we're talking about pretty major transformation of systems, and the way in which these systems changes involve everybody operating at whatever level they can. Whatever level you're operating, you end up making a contribution to our global systems. So the end of slavery is an example of a major systems change. And slavery still exists in places. The end of colonialism, colonial inheritance, and decolonizing is a part of systems change that we're still involved in. The end of apartheid, and yet structural racism remains an issue around the world. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving was a major movement to change how we view alcoholism and drunk driving, as well as efforts to carry on other social movements, like the pushback against the global AIDS and the Mothers Against Drunk Driving and AIDS. These are major social movements transforming systems. The efforts to reduce smoking worldwide is another transformational system. The Me Too movement to change sexual harassment. These are broad-based efforts to change how people think about what they do, how they behave, how they relate to each other, institutionally, individually, in families, and in communities. And so the nature of systems transformation is that it's emergent. It happens through decentralized actions of many diverse actors, including all of you. There's not some overall shared plan that's being implemented. We're all part of a emergent kind of systems in our work together. So it works across scales, from local to regional to national to international. Nonlinear means that small things that you do can ripple as it connects with other things that other people are doing. That makes it cumulative, that what we do separately and in our own spheres of influence from places around the world come together as systems transform. And those transformations often result in resistance because the way in which current systems operate are serving somebody's interests. And you find out whose interests are served when they don't want to see systems change. And so that's one of the challenges, is dealing with getting systems that are more equitable and sustainable in the face of the power dynamics that benefit from current systems. What we're going to do very quickly is just give you a sense of the different dimensions and elements of systems thinking. Not going to go into depth here. This is to begin as part of the masterclass, introducing some key distinctions. These come from an article on understanding system science that's in your readings. And it begins by distinguishing the core learning capabilities, being able to first see and understand systems. Secondly, being able to communicate across boundaries about systems change, and then using those understandings and collaborations to create desired futures of different systems, transformed systems. Historically, then, There's been interdisciplinary systems work across discipline. That's one form of transdisciplinary systems work, connecting biology, psychology, sociology, ecology together. A second part are different theories of systems, and you'll be encountering those throughout the master class. There are different ways of approaching systems, different models, different systems concepts. We're going to cover some of those today. And then the third arena are actually systems approaches to bringing about change. And at any given time, it's important to know when you're thinking and acting in a complex world, whether you're talking about the interdisciplinary understanding of systems, a particular systems approach, or whether you're engaged in systems change and how those things relate. And you see that likewise in this diagram, distinguishing the interdisciplinary dialogue at the top from systems theories on their left to systemic methods for change on the right. And all of that involves systemic thinking and acting in real world situations. That's pretty abstract in general, but it's to let you know that when you're dealing with systems language, you want to be clear about these different ways in which the people bring systems thinking into their work. And you see that as well here, different kinds of approaches, physical systems, living systems, cognitive systems, how we think, social systems, technological systems. These are affected and interconnected. And what we're going to be doing and what you do with early childhood is look at the interaction among these systems, but in ways that make it manageable. We deal constantly with making things manageable, but also dealing with complexity. So characteristics of systems. The parts are interdependent, such that a change in one part changes all the parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It consists of interconnected relationships. Boundaries are socially constructed. Perspectives vary. And systems are part of larger systems and function within subsystems. If you think about your family with these examples, if as new family members come in, as more children are born into a family, it changes the dynamics of the family relationship. And your family is not just made up of individuals. The family as a whole is more than your individual contributions to the family. The relationships among family members are critical in what constitutes the family. And the boundaries are socially constructed. There's the nuclear family. Many of you are from places around the world where extended families are very important, and cousins and larger term relationships and community connections. And those interrelationships between different family systems are part of what we're trying to look at when we understand how systems change at these different levels and in different ways. So I'm going to take you through a quick and simple systems thinking exercise that will help try to make this a little bit concrete. I'm going to imagine that you all have some sense of what a passionate kiss is. I expect you've probably experienced one, but you've certainly seen them in the movies or in TV shows. And so if you think about the systems that come into a passionate kiss, it begins with our biological systems, the ways in which our five senses, touching, feeling, sensing, the system of our cardiovascular system, our hormonal systems, our reproductive systems, our circulatory systems, our pulmonary systems. The notion of a passionate kiss is that our human body is made up of different subsystems, and that a passionate kiss begins to mobilize all of those systems in creating the combined passion of a kiss. But that passionate kiss takes place within a cultural environment that defines what it means. In medieval times, a kiss was a marriage pledge. There are political consequences to kissing. There are places where public kissing is illegal, and there are legal consequences. Kissing is used in advertising to try to get us to buy things, the entertainment business. And there are places where kissing is banned, as in there were efforts to reduce the kissing that people were doing on train platforms in London because it was slowing down trains taking off because of long lingering kisses. And we look at the family norms around kissing, religious norms around kissing, historical differences, geographic differences. Each of you are in countries where kissing has different potential meanings. That's a systems approach to something we're all familiar with, is to think about the multi-layered meanings of kissing. It's different to kiss to your children and your family than to kiss relatives and to kiss romantic interests, to have greetings of kissing with strangers. Those understanding, those dynamics is what gives us a systems perspective at the most basic level. So we're going to take you through another example here where you're thinking about the interconnections of systems as web of connections. And that's the visual that comes with systems. This is from a Dr. Seuss book, in a book about looking for different exotic animals. Young McGregor McGrew, who's looking for unusual zoo animals, and comes across a family of deer whose horns are so interconnected that you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. It's a beautiful representation of an interconnected family system that moves through the world together. But one of the most common examples of systems thinking that's used is the story that exists around the world about the 7 blind people and the elephant. Each one is touching a different part of the elephant. One touches the side, it says an elephant's like a wall. One touches the tail and says an elephant's like a rope. Another touches the tusk and says an elephant's like a spear. Another touches the trunk and says an elephant's like a snake. Another touches the leg and says it's like a tree trunk. Another touches the ear, says it's like a fan. And of course, the moral of the story is that you have to put all of those pieces together to get at the elephant. Now, let me pause to emphasize that that is widely used as a system story, and it is not. It is a linear add up the parts story. It treats the elephant as a distinct autonomous entity. But to actually understand elephants, no matter how many times you see an elephant in a zoo or put together the different parts of an elephant in a drawing like this, you won't understand the elephant until you understand it in its natural environment where it evolved. The elephants are social animals. They move through the world in herds, matrilineal herds that are organized to take care of the young. And you have to understand elephants in relationship to the flora and fauna in the Asian jungle and in the savanna in Africa, as they relate to the plants and other animals in those ecosystems where they've evolved, and how they interact as a herd, and of course have interactions with human systems that have affected the tribes, the ivory trade. And so to understand elephant from a systems perspective is to understand their interrelationships, the interconnections of elephants with other parts. And that's a basic principle of systems thinking, is to not take it apart what you're looking at, but to extend what you're looking at. What's the larger context? You're looking at early childhood programs. You're looking at the development of children. Don't just take apart their development. Look at the larger context within which that is occurring. And here from this cartoon, the zoo director is saying to the children, of course, things are slightly different in the wild. What we're talking about then is how the ways in which you conceptualize what's going on is going to affect what you get out. That our mental models, the things that we are able to take in, affect how we end up making sense of things, and our conceptual frameworks that do that.
Okay, so we are going to try to put this in the context of early childhood development for you now by just thinking about ways that what we might traditionally see as an early childhood development model could be transformed into more of a systems map. And so here we've just created a sample logic model that has what the traditional inputs are staff, research-based curriculum, location, funding. Then we move into activities, childcare, early care and education programming. Outputs are what directly results from it. So children who participate is usually just counted, the number of children who participate. Then we think about what are the short-term outcomes. So maybe some increased cognitive abilities, school readiness is improving, language and literacy skills, social emotional skills, more intermediate outcomes kind of down the line, maybe delinquent behaviors decrease, academic proficiency scores increase, mental health problems decrease. And then the long-term outcomes, graduation rates increase, crime rate decreases, household income increases. Often this is, what we're asked to produce, maybe by funders, or what we produce to really get at the very specifics and asking to be able to measure them. But what we are asking you to do is to really think more about how this appears in a complex, dynamic situation where you have the child there at the center and you think about what are their relationships. You have the direct relationships with the family, with the early childhood development program, with their peers. Maybe there are some other institutions that are important, religious institutions, healthcare, nutrition programs. Thinking about some of the other systems of influence in them. Maybe the welfare system, the legal system, nutrition, I said nutrition programs, transportation, and then thinking even more broadly, what are the contextual factors of influence? We have politics, economics, environment, social norms, culture. So wanting to not necessarily completely get rid of that linear project model, often it's a requirement and it may guide you, but really to think beyond that, as Michael said, to not just what the elephant is, but to the broader context. And, just as an example, my son is here. He has decided to join me right now for this talk. And things are complicated, right? We have a lot going on. And so we want to be able to acknowledge that and not oversimplify. The field in which you work has so many things that are impacting it. And so really trying to acknowledge and look at that complexity rather than ignore it and try to make something seem linear that actually isn't. I'll pass it back to Michael to talk us through this, this kind of more complex systems map.
So this can become very complex. And so it's a way of thinking through what's important within the particular context that you're operating on. There are times, like when the pandemic, where our biological systems become primary, health concerns become primary. There are times when the economic issues and poverty resources is front and center, or the political system, or on the bottom right, our values and culture is changing, or information and access is changing. The issues of vaccinations, for example, having them widespread, who has access to them. This is affected by the delivery systems, by the cultural systems, by the political systems, by our socioeconomic systems. And so the rigor of this, in a way, is simply beginning by asking these questions and asking, within whatever it is you're working on, what are the economic, what are the political, what are the cultural issues? What are the ecological issues? How does this relate to our basic functions as human beings? And those questions, as we did with the KISS example, as we did with the elephant example, how is what's going on here related to the larger environment? Systems thinking begins with asking systems questions. That's the heart of this. It has lots of complexities and different perspectives, but what it all has in common is systems thinking begins with asking systems questions. Keep that in mind so that you don't get overwhelmed. You're asking different questions. Logic models ask the questions of how do inputs relate in specific outcomes. Systems ask, what are the relationships and how are those unfolding?
Great. So now we're going to turn to some principles for systems thinking and evaluation. And I believe we shared this as a pre-read resource. So some of this may be familiar to you if you did the prep homework. But we wanted to just provide you with this framework, these set of principles, because there are many evaluation associations around the world. This comes from the American Evaluation Association. And we have some topical interest groups, one of which is called Systems and Evaluation. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to connect systems and evaluation. If you aren't in the US, there are evaluation associations all over the world. I believe the newest one is the Mongolian Evaluation Association that formed about a year ago. Maybe there's been newer ones since then, I don't know. But they're they're a great resource for connecting and thinking about how to apply this in your context. And then there are also global evaluation networks. But this comes out of the American Evaluation Association, and the Systems and Evaluation Interest Group looked at developing a set of principles for how to embed systems thinking in evaluation. And principles are a great way to think about systems because they provide guidance without being overly rigid. So this isn't a checklist. This isn't like a set of rules that are going to be exactly the same in every context that you work in. But these are meant to provide overarching guidance that needs to be contextualized to your specific situation. And so the first principle is to view the evaluation situation through the lens of systems thinking. So really just like basic stating that this is what you're going to be doing, is applying systems thinking to the evaluation. And then there are four principles that kind of basically go into a little bit more detail about how to do that. And I'm going to walk you through each of them: interrelationships, boundaries, perspectives, and dynamics. Michael, do you want to say anything more about how these came about for folks?
As Charmaine said, the group of people interested in systems and evaluation, some of whom are doing master classes in this series, came together to help the evaluators figure out how to approach systems. The question was there. And while I noticed in the chat, some of you are having a difficulty accessing the Google Docs. If you do a search engine search for principles for system thinking and evaluation, you'll be able to turn up this document. And it's a state-of-the-art way of trying to make thinking in systems accessible at its basic level, so that it's not everything, but it gives you the basics to be able to open up your mind and your relationships and collaboration through principles for systems.
Great. So just to briefly walk you through this, the overarching principle is to view evaluation through the lens of systems thinking. There are three operating principles for really how to do this. So first is to critically deliberate on and apply the principles that I will talk about, the four principles: interrelationships, perspectives, boundaries, and dynamics, in integrated ways. And then second is to understand and describe the various relationships and concepts and methods. So really just to be clear what you are applying. As Michael said, there are lots of different frameworks. Really understand how these things fit together. And then third is to ensure that any of your key evaluation documents identify and describe what systems concepts you're using, what frameworks you're using. Because, there are so many, and really wanting it to be clear that what you're applying and how you're thinking about both the intervention and the evaluation. So the interrelationships principle calls on us to critically deliberate on, work to examine, understand, and appropriately address the interrelationships regarding both the evaluand, the thing that's being evaluated, and the evaluation itself. So the first way to do that is to actually really try to identify and map out those interrelationships. So we saw some examples of systems maps. They can get much more complex than that. But what are the different relationships that influence or could influence or should influence what's happening with the intervention, and how does that connect to the evaluation? The next is to think about the actual relationships that could result from. So kind of coming out of the evaluation, of the intervention and the evaluation. And then what are alternative interrelationships and boundaries of the system as it's currently defined, and the consequences. So thinking about different possibilities, and then really making transparent and supporting the interrelationships that actually positively influence what you're trying to achieve. So it's thinking about not only what is already there, but what you're hoping to see and what you're hoping to not see, what you're hoping, the relationships that maybe are harmful, thinking about both what's working and what's not working. The perspectives principle then asks us to capture and critically deliberate on, or work to understand, represent, and address diverse perspectives. So within this principle, we have to really try to understand and represent whose perspectives and values are important within the system. And this is one of the ways that we really are focusing on equity and really trying to ensure that it's not just the dominant mindset or dominant perspectives that are getting attention within a system. So it really takes those relationships and understanding the relationships in order to really be able to elevate different perspectives. And then attending to power and dynamics within those perspectives and the consequences of that, whose perspectives tend to be given weight, and how can how can you as either an implementer or an evaluator bring attention to those power dynamics and look at how they are affecting both the intervention and the evaluation. Third is the boundaries principle. So really trying to understand what those boundary decisions are, because you really want to be intentional about how you're defining the system. So first is to identify the key boundaries that influence or should influence a situation, deliberating on those. So not doing that in isolation, but engaging those different perspectives and different relationships to think about the boundaries, and make transparent and justify those boundaries. So an example of this is thinking about the elephant. If you're thinking about the elephant as a system, that changes then if you're thinking about the ecosystem within which the elephant lives. That is a different way of thinking about boundaries. And as Michael said, thinking about the elephant as a system, sure, there are things operating within the elephant, but then you're missing all of the contextual pieces that are operating outside of the elephant. So trying to understand the implications of how you're setting boundaries is really important. And then lastly is the dynamics principle. So thinking about the patterns of change that are emerging within the system to understand their influence and significance, because systems are changing all of the time. We talk about system change as something we may be trying to influence, but systems are not static. They are dynamic and they're changing. And so consider how dynamics related to time, location, unanticipated and anticipated reactions, current rates and states of change and patterns are nonlinear. You're not necessarily going to be able to predict that, but you want to be able to be paying attention to how they're changing. And I think, we all were very, very much impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic that required us to see things changing at a much more rapid pace than they had before. And so that really started to speed up our way of thinking about dynamics and how things are changing, but they've been changing all along. It's just in terms of, how do we respond and whether or not we have to respond or choose to respond. So as Michael said, as we enter this era of the polycrisis, we're going to be asked to be much more responsive to the dynamics of the changing systems and how we are trying to influence the systems as they change, and how we are responding to systems changes that are outside of our control, and thinking about those interactions and how we try to track them within our evaluation and think about what are we contributing to and what are we responding to. So to take a little bit of a pause here to just think about the implications. I know it can be a lot and there's a lot to consider. We don't want to overwhelm you, but we want to provide you with a good foundation for going into the rest of the Masterclass series. It's just considering in your own work, what relationships are important to the early childhood development intervention that you might be a part of? Whose perspectives is it critical to understand, to represent, and to address? What are the boundaries of your intervention? And what patterns of change are emerging within the system, and how are they influencing the intervention and the evaluation? So we just want to leave you with those questions as something to consider going forward. And now we're going to transition into kind of our final framework that we want to offer to you as something that we really have found valuable. As Michael and I work with a lot of different, across sectors, a lot of different initiatives trying to influence systems, to transform systems. One of the resources that we also shared is called the Water of Systems Change. And this was put out by FSG maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. It's been a while. And it comes from this fable of two fish swimming in the water. And one says to the other, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" Because when you're in a system, it can be really hard to actually see the system. What do we mean by a system? And we've been talking about different ways to understand the system and different principles for, thinking about it. But one of the frameworks that we have found really resonate with people is coming from this Water of Systems Change, called the 6 Conditions of Systems Change. And this offers a research-based framework for thinking about systems within, at the top of this are kind of explicit things that you can often see and measure within systems, policies, practices, and resource flows that are a little bit easier to document, a little bit easier to see. They're at that top of the iceberg. In the middle here are relationships, connections, and power dynamics, more semi-explicit. They can be, they can be visible, they can be made visible. Again, really thinking about that connects back to the perspectives and relationships piece. But it takes a little bit more digging, a little bit more work, a little bit more qualitative research to uncover them. And then at the tip of the iceberg, much harder to see, are the mental models, the things, the way that we think about the world that shape the way that we understand the world. And those are much more difficult to uncover. But the idea is that all of these things work together to influence how systems operate. And if you want to be engaged in systems change, and changing systems and even working towards transforming systems, it's important to pay attention to all of these different 6 conditions and to think about the ways in which your initiative may be influencing them. And it's not to say that you necessarily have to deal with every single one within an initiative. I've seen some questions about, I run a project, like, can I be doing system change? And it's really about how you're connecting with other initiatives that are maybe working on some of these things, or at least paying attention to the ways in which you may be influencing certain aspects of systems. And if there hasn't been a way to influence others, what might that be? And so we really start by just asking some basic questions about what are the existing elements that are reinforcing current conditions within these different things, as a way to set up how you might respond to them, at least thinking about how they are influencing your work in early childhood development. And then you make an intentional choice about what you are able to address, and then where you might be needing to engage with others in a community. And that brings us towards thinking more about transformation as multiple initiatives working together, so that if you are clear about the aspects of the system that you are working with and are able to influence, we can bring those together to have a broader impact on systems and work towards systems transformation. So and I believe you have the access, hopefully, to the article, and the FSG has some good resources as well. But we found this to be a really powerful way to really put into some practical terms what how can we be influencing and thinking about systems? And then you can be evaluating that as you go, looking at how policies are changing, how practices are changing, how resource flows are changing, and really getting into some of those deeper relationships, power dynamics, and mental models, as you can start to see changes in those as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Michael to close out our piece, and then we're going to have a dialogue.
An example of the ways in which something can change as we understand from research and evaluation how this occurs. In 1999, the American Pediatrics Association was concerned about how the proliferation of screens might be affecting early childhood development, infants in particular, ages 0 to 6 or 0 to 2. And they formulated a policy recommending the practice that that infants should not be exposed to screens. No screens under the age of 2 was the mantra guidance, because they were worried about the effects of that. 20 years later, in 2019, they revised their guidance to no screens under age 2 without interaction. The problem was not the screens. The problems were people sitting infants down in front of televisions or computers to use them as babysitting and to not be interacting with the children. And so the no screens under age 2 switched to no screens under age 2 without interaction. But the interaction depends on the age of the child, what's on the screen, who's present, who else is around, what are the relationships within the household around the screen, and the ways in which technology and screens are changing in schools, in families, in communities, means that relationship culturally, politically, economically, who has access to what kind of screens, how are they used, and how are they used with young children, becomes a dynamic issue where we look at the research and evaluation of those interactions. So systems transformation from a global perspective here, what we call the blue marble. Blue marble is a reference to the view of the Earth from space, where there are no country divisions, where we're all part of one Earth family, and that we are affected by global systems. And global systems thinking helps us look at how whatever you're doing in your own arena is affected by these global polycrisis themes. And we simply want to note that evaluation is transforming in this regard. So for the last 50 years, evaluation has been focused on evaluating grants and projects and programs, clusters of grants, whether programs attain their goals and outcomes, and did implementation the way they were supposed to, generating conclusions and lessons and recommendations. And the field of evaluation has gotten really very good at that. They're great tools for SMART goals, for logic models, for theories of change. But now, in this world of systems transformation, we're being asked to evaluate mission, strategy, innovation, advocacy campaigns, policy change, systems change, complex dynamic interventions, community impacts, regional initiatives, networks and collaborations, leadership, inclusiveness and diversity, innovation, collective impact, scaling, environmental ecosystem sustainability, global system change, and transformation. None of these things are projects. And so part of the challenge is to be able to develop new evaluation approaches that are appropriate for evaluating systems change. And you'll be learning about those throughout the masterclass, and instead of turning system change into a linear project. We know how to do projects well, but we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them, as noted by the great Albert Einstein. So evaluation has evolved from focusing primarily on did a project attain its goals, and then introducing logic models to figure out how they attain their goals, and a theory of change, which introduced causality and research knowledge in how programs were effective, to now theory of transformation about how our programs lodged in larger systems. And I've become convinced over my 50 years of evaluation work that when projects are successful, they're usually successful because they actually cut themselves off from the larger system and they create outcomes within their own project domain, but that those don't have larger impacts because they're isolated and siloed. But that projects that are not successful are often crushed by the larger system dynamics. And so understanding how a program of early childhood development is related to these larger cultural, political, economic, ecological issues brings systems change into our world. And tracking those trajectories, then one of the things we want to give you a vision of is that global systems change comes from our connecting together across our different domains of interaction. And this masterclass is a wonderful example of that. Monitoring interconnectedness, how the people who are engaged here begin to form relationships to support each other, to nurture, catalyze, and accelerate transformational trajectories. The mantra here is to think globally, to act locally and globally, and evaluate the interactions so that the things that are going on globally, like climate change, like more refugees in the world now than ever since World War II, and exceeding those numbers, changing political boundaries, the polarization, the misinformation, social media, the ways in which power dynamics and resource flows and the climate are changing. These affect you wherever you are. And that looking at those connections is bringing global system thinking into the work. So being able to zoom out for the big picture and zoom in to where your own locality is to see those connections. Zooming out includes global information about child development, developments in attachment theory, developments in the effects of trauma on children, on the effects of nutrition on children, the family dynamics and cultural practices that affect child development. Zooming out to that big picture, being aware of how it's changing, how the concepts are developing within your local context and making that connection. So what you'll be getting into as you go along is a theory of transformation that includes how the systems you are a part of are affected by the work that you do. And that's what you'll be doing in the master class as you go along, is transforming international development infrastructure, how aid is done, how projects are carried out, so that we change both projects to being more systems oriented and transform evaluation to be able to evaluate systems transformation. And doing so, connecting together our global networks to support each other and having then a global impact as each of you, the way complex systems movements occur, it's not some top-down plan. All of you who are part of this are part of changing evaluation systems, evaluating networks, and that's how we are connected together. And with that, we want to bring in Hiro to share his experiences and applications to this work that we're engaged in together.
Thank you so much. What a treat to have your vast experience from so many different initiatives in so many sectors and the principles underlying them introduced. So I think this was a really great introduction to the series. And I think across the sessions, there'll be a lot of further connections to issues that I see have been coming up a lot in the chat and the Q&A around implementation, around the link between projects and systems, and questions really specific to the early childhood development sector. So I'm going to kick off our kind of dialogue section with just making 4 points relating these systems ideas to ECD. And so I'll first talk a little bit about the fact that the rise of ECD on the global practice and policy agenda was actually a marker of some systems shifts. Then talk about systems at two really different levels to make the point that systems principles apply no matter from the levels of really the developing child and even lower levels like molecules and molecular development. As you mentioned, biology is one of the fields that's contributed to systems thinking. And up to the level of societies, right, which are actually then the kind of ECD systems, national ECD systems, and their challenges and their coordination. And then a tiny note at the end on systems thinking, climate change, and indigenous peoples. So first, just noting that the forum that we're enjoying, which is the ECD Action Network, as a global network, came out of a rise of ECD on the global development agenda, which itself came from some systems transformations. And it is one where I think a lot of us are aware that research actually made a big difference, right? So decades of practical, practice-based evidence, but also neuroscientific and economic evidence, and the transformation of those into kind of societal narratives or ways to kind of shift mental models resulted in a new prominence of ECD on the global agenda, including in the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the Nurturing Care Framework that came out of the SDG coordination. The convergence of, large global organizations like the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Bank, built on decades of experience and investment in many countries around the world that had been investing in ECD for decades, but hadn't really coordinated into a global movement. And so I do think that some implicit mental models shifted to produce this global agenda. For example, what's been called the family bubble, which is that the public sector has no business intervening in families or doing family-based interventions. The kind of mental model that life course outcomes are really due to individual choices and are really therefore the responsibility of the family, not systemic or contextual influences. I think this occurred at a point when the history around the value and meaning of children in societies had shifted. And so Çiğdem Kagibachi was a distinguished developmental psychologist in Turkey who conducted a famous 30-year study showing that there was a shift in the meaning of children from more kind of economic additions to the household to more emotional, to having much more emotional meaning in families as the society moved from kind of subsistence level into industrialization and shifts in culture. So these all brought about, I think, a degree to which systems were aligned to produce a global consensus and a social movement across countries to support ECD investment. Many of us are part of these in our local communities and in our local countries. And the Nurturing Care Framework, I can point out, is a multi-systems framework, right? To think about health and nutrition and responsive caregiving, security and safety and early learning together will require a great deal of systems alignment, which I'll get to in a moment. One challenge, a question that a systems example of a question that a systems perspective raises is whether systems are aligned towards quality and not just access. This has been a big puzzle and question for the field in a way that the ECD field has moved. And a recognition of actually some mistakes that were made in focusing just on access. If we think of what happened to access to primary education, which shot up during the MDG, Millennium Development Goal era, but without sufficient attention to quality, producing what became a global learning crisis, right? So we know we have a lot of issues with primary education systems needing to shift towards quality as well as access. And that's something that is absolutely top of mind for many ECD program implementers, policymakers, researchers. So that's an example of a systems question of how coherent is a system towards issues of quality and not just access to drive what we are all interested in, which is to kind of improve human potential and development and thriving. Turning to child development, just to point out that early childhood is a period of massive systems change if we just consider the developing child as a system, right? So the motor, cognitive, language, emotional development systems, physical development are all interconnected. And across early childhood, in each of these areas, we know that child development proceeds towards greater differentiation and complexity. And just as an example, the kind of different domains of executive function, like working memory or inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, tend to kind of glom onto each other as one set of skills in early childhood, and then across development start differentiating into separate skills. And that happens with development in general. But the point of interdependence, interrelatedness across different domains of development is a very key principle. And the other one is how infants and toddlers develop in reciprocal relation to their environments, right? So that children are both acting on their environments from day one and are shaped by their environments in return. And that is really a systems principle of interdependence and feedback loops and how caregivers influence children, but children also influence caregivers and their communities. So we have to recognize how these parts are interconnected and interdependent. In the area of child development, I also think that Western models, I think you hinted at this, Western models have developed from philosophy on up to view people as isolated individuals, societies that function to reward individual merit, and the whole kind of equaling the sum of the parts, right? But non-Western patterns of socialization and development have been demonstrated over and over again to show more interdependent ways of socialization. And so I refer folks back to kind of the classic work and ongoing work by Barbara Rogoff, who talks about how learning occurs in many non-Western societies, including the Mayan villages that she has studied for decades, in a process of learning by observing and pitching in, rather than didactic adult-to-child instruction, where learning goes one way from adults to children. And so one phenomenon here is that cooperative learning between adults and children and between children is the norm in many societies around the world. But as globalization and things like rote instruction might take hold, learning becomes less cooperative and more individual and competitive. And these are phenomena that she's observed in Mayan villages across time as globalization takes hold, less cooperation and more individual and competitive kind of learning. So this role of culture really plays out at these levels that are as micro as the interactions between adults and children, between among peers, and how children learn from their peer groups up to the level of societies. The third point I wanted to make is that ECD systems are unique and uniquely challenging in some ways, because, first of all, they need to be developmentally sequenced. The periods of prenatal, perinatal, postnatal, infancy and toddlerhood, pre-primary years, and the transition to primary schooling and middle childhood is a massive amount of change in human development. It occurs in ways that are supported by family, peer, and community systems, and then by the broader practice and policy systems that I think you presented in the second half of the presentation. And those broader practice and policy systems in early childhood, therefore, have to provide not only different kinds of supports between the prenatal and middle childhood periods, so they have to shift and be nimble in the kinds of programs they support, but they also have to be coordinated. And so these sectors of health, nutrition, water and sanitation, social protection, education, and child protection each function as complex human systems. And for the purposes of supporting early childhood development, they do need to be coordinated. Finance and governance systems are as overlays and as structures that provide the resource flows through which these aspects of child development are supported have to be coordinated. Each of these systems have associated workforces, and so this issue of multi-sectoral coordination, of course, is a really important one in ECD. And then we can also think of the vertical coordination in complex systems from the national to the subnational and the local levels, and how resource flows and evidence and information flow back and forth across those levels, or don't flow back and forth. And so we see systems that don't function if information about the front line isn't moving up in the system, or resource flows from the national level are not flowing down to the local level, right? And so these are by nature inherently systems questions. And I think as a field, we have gaps. And so I think a lot of the later masterclass sessions will start focusing on implementation science. And I think a big gap that we have in the field is that we tend to measure adult-child interactions and child development, but not higher level systems functioning. We're not really looking at the feedback loops that are occurring above the level of the frontline and their supervisors and trainers. We're not linking what the competencies should be at the subnational level often, what the leadership capacities need to be in a workforce, even if it's a single sector workforce and just, for example, a health system or a preschool system, or for example. So, and then I would, just add, I think there was a lot of questions about, does every project involve every system? And they don't. And so I think there is a way that we can talk about kind of bringing systems principles to the level of analysis that you're particularly working on at the moment, whether it's a specific kind of training program, whether it's actually a single organization, right? So single organizations are complex human systems as soon as they get beyond one individual. So we can think about how does an organization get oriented towards learning, towards absorbing and collecting information in a way that makes it a learning organization moving towards certain systems level goals, right? Finally, the just really brief point I wanted to make was around climate change, because I did appreciate that you framed the entire presentation around issues of climate and the global polycrises. And just wanted to point out that indigenous ways of thinking and funds of knowledge are systems oriented. So work by Megan Bang and others has shown that children from indigenous backgrounds display more systems thinking than non-indigenous children from living in the same cities or communities. And so, and that's a reflection of the fact that at the macro level, indigenous cultures have historically protected our global environment and biodiversity and our resources. And in fact, indigenous communities safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity are on indigenous community lands. About 36% of remaining intact forests are on indigenous peoples' lands, and forests on their land are better maintained with higher preserved biodiversity than those on non-indigenous lands. And we, of course, know the systems factors that create extractive approaches to land and the environment. So I just wanted to close on that point. Maybe we can first, would love to hear your reactions to these kind of examples that are coming from the ECD world, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, which I think Shekufe is going to curate, and I think folks have been voting on questions. So, but yeah, would first love to hear what any reactions or thoughts. And Shekufe, yeah, please also jump in with your thoughts, given that you know the ECDAN audience, better than probably any of us do. So.
Let me just quickly pick up on your last point and reinforce it, both that the knowledge base, the rich knowledge base you bring about what's happening and the changes in early childhood understanding, the different cultural bases, and connecting it again back to climate change. One of the places to watch for this is in UNICEF came out with a report and is tracking the effects of climate change on children. And in this report, unless we act now, they go through the effects of climate change on children. and make the statement that in every crisis, children are the most vulnerable, and climate change is no exception. And they have maps of how the way in which climate change is unfolding is putting children at great risk, and entire economic and social systems at great risk. And so it invites us again to work on our individual arenas of action, but to all be a part of the systems change around the issues of climate, which are global issues. And I'll put in the chat again the link to the declaration that you can sign, recognizing that evaluation and all of us need to deal with the connection between social, economic, and ecological systems. And the issues that you raised about how the bringing early childhood onto the global scene is itself a systems change is the one that I think really reinforces as a global community how we together can accelerate that momentum and its importance.
Charmaine, do you have additional kind of thoughts or reactions?
Well, I'm hearing some, you know, I know there's a lot of hesitation around this. Feels like so much and it's expensive and it, you know, do we all have to be doing this? And I think there's sort of that balance of what happens if you don't do it? Like, are you actually being as effective as you could be if you don't take into account the context in which you're working? And as I said, I think COVID showed us all that we had to really pivot and think differently about our work. And so as we get into more of these complex crises, it's really more about you can't keep doing the work the way that you've been doing it without some acknowledgement of the systems within which you're working, but it doesn't mean you have to do everything. And so I think here you kind of mentioned that is like thinking about within those 6 conditions of systems change, where can you connect and where can you leverage, what can you do, and what funders are out there who are interested in this, because I know there are some very limiting funding models, but there are also funders who are looking for this, and it's you know, a give and take. Like, we have a responsibility to push them to think more broadly about how they're funding the work and make the case for it, as well as adapting the work in the best ways that we can, even when it feels more limiting. And so I just, you know, it's about finding that balance and not trying to do it all, but not being able to just stick with what you've been doing if it's been completely, you know, outside of thinking about the systems and the connections.
No, that's right. And I think one kind of hopeful point I take away from the systems perspective is that you can apply it at the fairly micro level of a single organization. You can think about it within a traditional topic like professional development, for example. You can think of it in terms of the relationship between a program and a community, and the factors that are influencing that community, looking outward. And so from any perspective that you stand, whether it's the individual child, whether it's the family, the organization, a workforce, or a budget, right? The national budget. You can actually apply systems principles to understand the ways that a phenomenon is constrained by or enabled by broader systems and is influencing systems within it, subsystems within it. And that's the flexibility of this kind of systems thinking. It doesn't always have to be at national scale, for example. So, yeah. Shekufe, what do you think?
Yes, I'm going to come in. I mean, we have 48 questions, which we obviously will not be able to respond to all. And Charmaine has been doing a great job at responding. So colleagues, if you see the answered question and Charmaine has been putting some resources, we've been copying it over to chat. But I'll read out a couple of questions for all 3 of you. One is, do we risk initiatives becoming jacks of all trades, masters of none, if all relationships, contexts, etc. need to be factored in ECD? A variant of that keeps coming up in terms of, you know, yeah. So that's one, and I'll ask another one as well. The other one to ask is oh. Okay, how about we go with that one until I find the one that I was pinning? But there are so many questions that are just streaming in, and lots of great information in the chat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can expand just on the last thing I said, which is that you can take a systems perspective to a single sector intervention, right? Like with using kind of ECD speak, right? Like let's say you're working in the health sector on a particular program, you can look at an organization through a systems perspective, stay completely within that sector and yet apply a systems perspective, right? It doesn't always mean that every program has to cover health and nutrition and sanitation and child protection and education. Partly developmental needs change over, so it depends what age of child your program supports. And yeah, so I think I just do want to reiterate that it is not always thinking about the grand national policy framework, but it can be an organizational context, it can be a community context to which a systems principle is applied.
My sense is that as you move into this and try it out, that it will change how you understand what you're doing in fundamental ways. That it sounds abstract, it sounds like a lot, but I'll give you a simple example. For 50 years, my go-to question in every evaluation I do is to ask people, what's the most important thing you got out of this program, whatever kind it is? And I've done a lot of evaluations of early childhood parent development programs and early childhood support programs, daycare centers, and with parents, with community people. And always within the top three things people say they got out, and most often, number one, is they say the most important thing they got were the relationships with other people, the relationships with other parents, the relationships with staff. And yet those relationships are virtually never part of the logic model. They're never part of the measured outcomes of the program. We are social beings. We are social human beings. And so our relationships and how those affect how we engage in the world, we're not just autonomous individuals. And yet most of our models of intervention don't treat us as social interrelationship beings. They treat us as empty vessels to pour in knowledge. Most of the models are individual of outcomes, pre and post. What did you learn? What's your knowledge? What's your individual behavior? But not looking at how our behaviors we know are embedded in social systems. And that to begin to open it up in that way, just begin by asking the systems questions in your own life. How is what you do and who you become related to the other people and the other things around you? How are you affected and have been affected? That's the window into systems thinking. Then you can apply it in your work.
And thanks, Michael and Charmaine. So I think we're getting some really nice feedback in the chat about the session. And colleagues, I encourage you to fill up the survey that Shreya has been sharing in the chat so we can capture some of these insights. But I think that's another question, is how can individuals whose training is in siloed disciplinary perspectives acquire systems thinking? What can political scientists, economists, psychologists, sociologists learn? How can they learn about thinking in systems?
Go ahead.
Charmaine, Michael, Hero, yeah.
There are great resources in the Masterclass. I mean, that's what this class is about. That's what the course is about, is exposing people to that. And so it's like any learning. There's a learning curve. You learn a new sport, you learn a new art, you learn to play the piano. You learn to use technology, you learn computers. You don't begin at an expert level. You begin in small steps. And so the first thing is to start, is to not be intimidated by how do I become an expert in this. You begin every inquiry by starting where you are. The great African-American tennis star Arthur Ashe was often asked, he was the first African American to win world championships in tennis. And he was often asked, how do I deal with racism as an individual, as a white person, as a young person? And his answer was always, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Start where you are, start asking systems questions, start trying out systems, connect with other people, do the readings in this course, participate in as many sessions as you can. That's the learning curve. We all have to go through that. I'm still learning about this. Hero and Charmaine are still learning about it. It's not like you reach a level and you don't learn anymore. It's unfolding, but you have to begin. And it builds momentum of itself as you develop a taste for it and see what a difference it makes.
I think these principles are becoming recognized in different sectors like education, but also, since they came partly out of child development, I think some of the resources that are being shared, and I'll just make sure they are included, are coming from the child development area, because this happens to be an area that also produced quite a lot of great thinking and research. And I learned first about some of the systems perspectives in developmental research from the work of Esther Thalen, who was an expert in infant motor development, and really viewed the different functions of infants and how they grow and how they coordinate. Just think of the coordination of limbs and vision and perception, and the difference between an infant who's 12 weeks old versus a year old versus 18 months old, right? These are vast changes. And so a lot of developmental research actually was founded in this very close observation and recognizing that as these dramatic shifts happen in child development, there's yet some continuity, right? There are kind of, and that's this emergent principle in systems that, any of us who have socialized or been around kids or raised kids, you see that child and the continuity of who that child is across these massive changes in development that are, producing what we know of as how complex and interrelated language and cognition and feelings and social development are. And so I think developmental research actually is a great place to start if you want to read about systems principles. Before
One of my favorite examples of paradigm shift that you referred to is the notion, especially in the West, that children are these empty vessels, and the parents and teachers are constantly acting on them and filling them in and controlling their behavior, versus the paradigm that says, from the moment they're born, children are acting on the world. They are human beings. They're not just recipients. They are acting. And if you learn to pay attention and respond to them, respond to what's happening to the child, is very different than simply seeing that as an empty vessel that you're doing things to. That's a huge systems paradigm shift about the nature of that relationship and the dynamics of that. So look for examples in your own world that you can help understand and then communicate to other people in that very way that Hero's sharing.
And I think that it's important just to recognize, again, with this push of finding your confidence in pushing back against some of the paradigms that are, and the funding that's requiring you to think linearly. We are seeing much more open to the openness and recognition of this than we have ever before. And so really using your voice in whatever way you have to push back on, trying to be put in a linear box, as well as then really connecting with others who are trying to do this. So the fact that this network is available to, support you all, one another, so that you all don't feel like you're trying to do this alone, but that there's really a movement towards this is really powerful. And I put in the chat a link to the Blue Marble Evaluation Network to connect if you're looking for evaluators to support that. We are trying to build the capacity of our community to support communities like yours who are trying to do this, to be able to do it well.
Thank you all for the excellent input. I think these are really great questions that will drive this whole set of master class sessions on systems forward. So yeah. really great.
Before we go, thank you everyone. Just really quickly, just want to go over a few next steps from the series. It doesn't matter how many times we tell everyone everything will be available, we still get the same question. But guys, everything will be recorded, everything will be available on the website. Just a big reminder, if you want the certificate, the survey questions that Shreya is putting in the chat, please complete that. That's a must and a necessary for us to track. If you want more resources on systems thinking, you can go to egdan.org, go to the thematic pages, and we actually have a whole thematic page on systems thinking where you can find loads of resources. All the resources that the speakers will be sharing, that's all on the Masterclass website as well. And then go over to ECD Connect, which is our community platform. There's already a thread on this session, so you can go over there, chat with each other. If you have questions for Charmaine and Michael, you can put them in there. We'll either compile them and give it to them to answer, or have colleagues and Hero as well answer on the thread, and that's a great place for us to continue the conversation. The next session is starting in 30 minutes, so if you haven't registered already, go over, register, sign in. It's with Emily Gates and Aisha Yousafzai. And sessions for tomorrow, we have Bob Williams from Australia and Aaron Watson, going over this. So a lot of great sessions coming up. Please spread the word with others in your networks, organizations, so they can all benefit from it. Again, this is entirely free and open to the world. So I think the world showed up today. Thank you, everyone. A big thank you to Charmaine and Michael and Hero, and a big thank you to the ECDAN team who's been working tirelessly over the past months to bring this all together for you, to Shreya Prakash, Hannah Fromm, Catherine, and Carol. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And for those who are still eager for more systems, see you in half an hour at the next session. Thanks again, Michael and Charmaine and Hero. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Michael and Charmaine, we have so many questions in the Q&A. It's astonishing. We have over 54 questions, but anyhow, great interest. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I tried to answer some. I didn't get to them all, but